Comrades, have you ever wondered, looking at the flawless, shining, glossy facade of the Soviet space triumph, what monumental and at times truly frightening drama was playing out behind the deafening backstage of the great space race? On April 12, 1961, the whole world shuddered from the roar of rocket engines as the spacecraft Vostok 1 lifted off from the launch pad, carrying into the cosmic abyss a man with a dazzling, radiant smile. Yuri Gagarin instantly became a living icon. His name thundered across all continents, and his image forever sealed in history the greatness of the Soviet state. But few know that on that very spring day, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, just a few meters from the roaring rocket, in an identical bright orange pressure suit, stood another man, whose heart was beating with the same inhuman frequency, and who, until the very last second before launch, did not know whether he was destined to become the first face of a new era or to forever dissolve in the silent shadow of his comrade. His name is Gherman Titov, and his fate became the embodiment of one of the deepest psychological tragedies of the Soviet era. A story of how the ruthless cogs of the great Soviet machine selected perfect heroes, and how the lives of those who, by the will of the party directive, ended up merely as number 2, were broken. The official chronicle, carefully packaged in the scarlet slogans of the newspaper Pravda, always presented this choice as the result of pure science, objective medical indicators, and the flawless work of the State Commission. But if everything was so transparent, why do they still find crossed-out paragraphs in the secret folders of the Politburo? And why have sinister rumors circulated for decades in the whispers of communal kitchens and in the smoking rooms of closed defense research institutes that Gagarin was far from the first, but merely the first to survive? To unravel this tangled web of facts, hidden intrigues, conspiracies, and genuine betrayal, we will have to look much deeper than official textbooks allow and transport ourselves to the atmosphere of total secrecy, suspicion, and frenzied rivalry that reigned at the dawn of the space age. In the late 1950s, the Soviet Union was at the very peak of its industrial might, and simultaneously in a state of the fiercest ideological clash with the United States of America. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev demanded not just results from the designers, he needed political triumphs capable of crushing the capitalist world on the informational field. In this atmosphere, behind closed doors of defense departments and under the watchful eye of the Kremlin stars, a top-secret directive is born about the start of selecting candidates for a flight on fundamentally new, unprecedented vehicles. The leadership of this ambitious project is entrusted to the father of Soviet cosmonautics, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. From the very beginning, this project was accompanied by fierce behind-the-scenes confrontation between various departments: the Air Force, the Academy of Sciences, the Ministry of Defense, and Korolev's secret OKB-1 waged a continuous struggle for control over the future program. The generals demanded that the cosmonaut be an obedient executor of military orders. The scientists saw him as a researcher, and Korolev sought a man capable of withstanding extreme physical stress while also becoming a flawless pilot. Here, the cynical yet mathematically precise logic of Soviet bureaucracy and engineering calculation comes into full force. Korolev needed not just experienced aces, but pilots whose physical parameters would perfectly fit the rigid constraints of the cramped cabin of the Vostok spacecraft under construction. Out of 3,000 of the best military fighter pilots serving at remote airfields in the Arctic, on Sakhalin, and in the Volga region, The harsh sieve of the initial selection passed only 12 dozen men. Their personal files were scrutinized under a microscope in special departments, where not only their loyalty to the party was checked, but also their lineage up to the third generation. Any blemish in a relative's biography, the slightest suspicion of unreliability, or time spent in occupied territory during the war automatically barred the way to the project. In the spring of 1960, 20 selected young officers, who would form the very first legendary squad, arrived secretly in Moscow at the Central Aviation Research Hospital, disguised as civilian specialists. They were forbidden to speak of their work even to their wives, and in official documents their activities were referred to as testing new equipment. The medical protocols from those years, hidden under classifications of supreme secrecy, are still shocking today for their extreme, near-cruel severity. The men were forced to undergo tests at the very limit of human endurance, as none of the scientists knew for certain how the human body would react to weightlessness and cosmic radiation. They were spun at furious speeds in giant centrifuges, where G-forces reached 10 Gs, and the pilots' faces would literally slide towards their ears from the rush of blood. They were scorched in thermal chambers at 70-degree heat to test their body's thermoregulation, and dropped in baro chambers to immense virtual altitudes, where the air became extremely thin. But perhaps the most terrifying test was the isolation chamber, a room completely cut off from the outside world, soundproofed, where a candidate would spend 10 to 15 days in complete isolation, silence, and semi-darkness. This was a test of mental fortitude against sensory deprivation. Some couldn't withstand it. They began to hallucinate, talk to the walls, break down into screams, or sink into deep apathy. The cogs of the Soviet machine ruthlessly ejected anyone who showed the slightest malfunction. It was at this stage that the first tragedies and the first hidden losses began. Losses which Soviet citizens were never meant to learn about. One of the most promising candidates was Anatoly Kartashov, a superb pilot who had demonstrated astounding results. But during another test on the centrifuge under an 8G load, small pinpoint hemorrhages, petechiae, were discovered on his back. The doctors delivered a ruthless verdict: vascular fragility. Kartashov was instantly, within a single day, dismissed from the squad, written off to a remote provincial unit, and forbidden from even hinting at where he had been for the last few months. His career was destroyed, and he carried the burden of an unbearable resentment towards the system that had used him and discarded him like spent material until the end of his days. A similar fate befell Valentin Varlamov. While relaxing at a river, he dove unsuccessfully and sustained a serious injury to his cervical vertebra. For the space program, he died in that very instant. He was transferred to administrative work, struck from the lists of future conquerors of the universe. The system did not forgive weaknesses or accidents. It needed perfect bio-robots, capable of enduring all the circles of hell. But the most terrifying, soul-chilling tragedy occurred just 19 days before Gagarin's historic flight. On March 23, 1961. The youngest member of the squad, 24-year-old Valentin Bondarenko, was finishing his 10-day stay in a soundproof chamber under increased pressure, in an atmosphere saturated with pure oxygen. Having completed the medical tests, he removed the sensors, wiped the attachment points with a cotton swab soaked in alcohol, and carelessly threw it away. The cotton wool landed on the hot coil of an electric hot plate the Cosmonaut used to heat food. In the 100% oxygen environment, a terrible, instantaneous fire erupted. Due to the pressure difference, it was impossible to open the chamber's airtight door immediately. Doctors and duty officers watched in horror through the observation window as a living man burned alive in the confined space. When Bondarenko was finally pulled out, he was still alive and whispered, "Don't blame anyone. It's my own fault." He died in terrible agony in the hospital over several hours. His body was almost completely charred, with only the soles of his feet remaining unharmed, which is where doctors administered painkillers. Bondarenko's funeral was held under the strictest secrecy in Kharkiv. His family was ordered to remain silent, and his face was meticulously cut out of all group photos of the squad by KGB censors. This incident was a severe psychological shock for the remaining cosmonauts. They realized that death was stalking them on Earth itself, but the party leadership was most afraid that news of the pilot's death would leak to the West and undermine the propaganda effect of the upcoming triumph. This was the first major cover-up, which spawned an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust within the project itself. By the beginning of 1961, the 6 strongest candidates had been formed from the remaining pool, the so-called Vanguard, within which an incredibly intense behind-the-scenes rivalry unfolded. This group of 6 included Yuri Gagarin, Gherman Titov, Grigory Nelyubov, Andrian Nikolaev, Pavel Popovich, and Valery Bykovsky. The 2 clear leaders, neck and neck in all metrics, were Gagarin and Titov. An unspoken but very sharp rivalry existed between them, fueled by ambition and the understanding that the first step onto another planet would bring absolute, eternal immortality. Genuine intrigue was woven in the corridors of Star City. The head of cosmonaut training, General Nikolai Kamanin, was playing his own game. He meticulously recorded every step, every word of the pilots, compiling their psychological profiles for a subsequent report to the Central Committee of the CPSU. Notably, a secret vote was held among the cosmonauts themselves. They were given anonymous questionnaires with one question: who, in your opinion, should fly first? The overwhelming majority of the men indicated the name Yuri Gagarin. He possessed a unique gift for winning people over. His good nature and openness diffused any conflicts. Gherman Titov, however, was completely different. He was an intellectual, an aesthete, a man of a refined spiritual constitution and an independent character. He could answer his superiors sharply, had his own opinions on technical matters, and didn't always fit within the rigid framework of military subordination. Korolev valued Titov for his sharp mind and deep understanding of technology. He saw in him a researcher capable of solving the most complex problems in orbit. However, the final decision was made not in the design bureau or at a medical consultation, but in the offices of Staraya Square, where the highest party nomenclature convened. Here we approach the most significant political conspiracy that predetermined the fate of Gherman Titov. Researchers claim that Titov was deprived of his legitimate right to be the first cosmonaut on the planet solely because of his biography and his name. Consider this historical context. It was the era of Khrushchev, the time of the so-called thaw. But the wounds inflicted by the Great Patriotic War were still bleeding in the hearts of millions of Soviet people. And so, 2 personal files are brought for approval to the country's top leadership. Mikhail Suslov, secretary of the CPSU Central Committee and the party's chief ideologist, reviewing the documents, paid attention to the name of the second candidate, Herman. For a Soviet person in the early 60s, this name was firmly associated with the enemy, with German occupiers. The ideologists reasonably feared that if the first Soviet cosmonaut, a symbol of the triumph of socialism, were named Herman, it would cause muffled grumbling or misunderstanding among ordinary workers and war veterans. Furthermore, Titov's origins raised serious questions among party orthodoxists. His father, Stepan Pavlovich Titov, was a village teacher, an intellectual who was fond of music, played the violin, and named his son after the hero of Pushkin's The Queen of Spades. For the Soviet propaganda machine, such a pedigree seemed excessively bourgeois and aristocratic. They needed a completely different hero, simple, understandable, one of their own for every Soviet worker. And Yuri Gagarin fit this role perfectly. He was the living embodiment of the Soviet dream. Born in the village of Klushino in the Smolensk region, his father was a simple carpenter, his mother a milkmaid on a collective farm. During the war, the boy endured terrible months of German occupation, saw the horrors of war with his own eyes, then struggled hard in life, studied at a vocational school, worked at open hearth furnaces in Lyubertsy, and only later took the controls of a fighter jet. His profile was crystal clear, truly proletarian, red calico, and his famous smile, capable of melting any ice, finally convinced Nikita Khrushchev. It is said that Khrushchev, upon seeing Gagarin's photograph, firmly stated, "He will fly. This is the face of our people." Titov was pushed to second place by a party directive, and this decision inflicted a deep psychological trauma on him that he carried throughout his life. This injustice and total secrecy gave rise to a colossal number of alternative versions and conspiracy myths outside the Soviet Union. The Western world, understanding that the USSR was hiding the real state of affairs, tried to probe the situation using radio intercepts. This is how the famous and frightening theory of lost cosmonauts was born. Italian radio amateurs, the brothers Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordiglia, organized a private radio interception station near Turin, and in the late 50s began claiming to hear strange, chilling signals from space. They claimed to have intercepted the beating of a dying human heart, which gradually slowed and faded in space. Another time, they allegedly recorded a frantic, panicked female voice in Russian, which, through the crackle of interference, cried out, "I'm hot, I'm very hot, I see flames. Am I going to crash?" According to these unverified versions, before Gagarin, the Soviet government sent several pilots, Alexei Ledovsky, Sergei Shaborin, Andrei Mitkov, to certain death. All of them supposedly died due to brake engine failures and remained in eternal orbits, turning into cosmic ghosts. By this logic, Gagarin was not the first man in space at all, but merely the first to return from there alive, and Titov was kept in strict reserve as a backup in case Gagarin's flight ended in disaster during the broadcast, so that an official denial could be instantly issued and a second ship launched. The most elaborate conspiracy theory, which still finds devoted adherents, is connected to the name of the famous Soviet test pilot Vladimir Ilyushin, son of the legendary aircraft designer Sergei Ilyushin. He was a true ace, having set several world records for speed and altitude in jet aircraft. The legend states that it was Ilyushin, with his colossal experience, who made the first ever spaceflight aboard the spacecraft Rossiya on either the 7th or 9th of April 1961, that is, several days before the official date. However, during the return to Earth, a serious failure occurred in the navigation system. The spacecraft deorbited at an uncalculated angle, and the pilot made a hard emergency landing on the territory of Communist China. In those years, relations between Nikita Khrushchev and Mao Zedong were ruined to the extreme. and a serious schism was brewing between the countries. Chinese intelligence services allegedly captured the wounded Ilyushin, hid him in a closed hospital, and used him as a tool for harsh political blackmail against the Kremlin. The Soviet leadership found itself in a hopeless situation. To admit the disaster and the capture of their best pilot would mean suffering a crushing geopolitical defeat at the hands of their closest ally in the socialist camp. And so, under conditions of the strictest secrecy, a decision was made to activate Plan B, to urgently send Yuri Gagarin into space, who would make a fully successful flight under the spotlight of the world's news agencies to overshadow the Chinese compromat. Ilyushin was allegedly returned to his homeland only at the cost of enormous political and economic concessions to China, and his official absence in the USSR during those days was explained by a severe car accident, after which he was said to have gone to Beijing for rehabilitation. Conspiracy theorists claim that Gherman Titov was well aware of this secret, and that is precisely why his psychological state before Gagarin's launch was close to breaking. He understood that he was going as a replacement for a man who might already be languishing in the dungeons of a foreign intelligence service. However, if we turn to the dry, verified historical facts and declassified documents from the Ministry of Defense, the KGB, and the memoirs of the designers themselves, these elegant spy theories crumble like a house of cards. Vladimir Ilyushin was indeed involved in a terrible car accident, but it happened back in June 1960. He suffered severe fractures in both legs, underwent long-term treatment in Moscow, and indeed went to China in early 1961, as their specialists were renowned for their traditional medicine and massage, capable of getting the pilot back on his feet. He never had any relation to the space program. His anthropometric data, a height of nearly 180 centimeters, physically prevented him from fitting into the tiny sphere of the Vostok descent module. As for the mysterious radio intercepts by the Judica Cordiglia brothers, the Soviet archives have revealed a simple truth. To test communication and telemetry systems before the manned flight, Korolev launched unmanned satellite ships. Inside these ships were dummies, nicknamed Ivan Ivanoviches by the engineers. Inside these dummies were tape recorders playing looped recordings. To prevent American tracking stations from thinking the USSR was secretly launching people, these tapes broadcast not technical commands, but recordings of performances by the famous Pyatnitsky Choir and culinary recipes for borscht. It was these fragments of human voices, emanating from space, that Western radio amateurs picked up, mistaking the songs of Soviet peasants for the death rattles of perishing cosmonauts. But the true tragedy of the Soviet system lay not in these fabricated deaths, but in the real, merciless betrayal of its own heroes, whose names were erased from history with a particular, refined cruelty. If, for some reason, you did not fit within the framework of the perfect Soviet myth, you simply ceased to exist for the entire world. The most terrible example of such a fate was the story of Grigory Nelyubov. The man who held third place in the squad hierarchy was the official backup for Gagarin and Titov, and possessed Cosmonaut Certificate number 3. Nelyubov was incredibly talented, possessed fierce charisma, leadership qualities, and magnificent physical fitness. Korolev himself singled him out among the others and planned to entrust him with leading the first, most complex orbital maneuvers on future spacecraft. But Grigory's fate was broken due to a trivial domestic incident steeped in the whisper of alcohol and wounded pride. Along with 2 other cosmonauts from the squad, Ivan Anikeyev, and Valentin Filatyev, Nelyubov was relaxing in the buffet at the Chkalovskaya railway station. There, they got into a verbal conflict with a military patrol. The matter could have been hushed up. The commandant was ready to accommodate the future heroes if Nelyubov had simply apologized to the patrol chief. But Grigory, feeling like the conqueror of the universe any minute, displayed excessive pride and flatly refused to ask for forgiveness. The report went upstairs, onto the desk of General Kamanin. The leadership of the space program, tired of periodic disciplinary violations among the young pilots, decided to stage a demonstrative flogging. Nelyubov, along with his comrades, was mercilessly expelled from the Cosmonaut squad and exiled to a remote aviation unit in the Far East. For a man who stood on the threshold of eternal worldwide fame, this was tantamount to a death sentence. Grigory tried to return, wrote letters to Korolev and Kamanin, begged for a chance to redeem himself, but the Soviet bureaucratic machine never revisited its punitive directives. Moreover, a regime of total oblivion was activated. Nelyubov's face was crudely erased from all official group photographs of the first squad using retouching. His name was forbidden to be mentioned in the press, and all his contributions to the program were annulled. Watching his comrades fly into space one after another, receive the Order of Lenin, nomenklatura rations, apartments in Moscow, and bathe in the rays of worldwide fame, Nelyubov sank into the deepest psychological depression, began to drink heavily, and in February of 1966, in a state of complete despair, committed suicide by throwing himself under the wheels of a passing train. The system ground him up and didn't even notice, leaving only an unmarked grave in a distant cemetery. The psychological drama of Gherman Titov himself was no less profound, although outwardly it looked like a story of grand success. On April 9, 1961, with 3 days left until the launch, Kamanin officially announced the commission's decision to the pilots. Gagarin would fly first. Titov was the backup. In his personal diaries, Kamanin noted that Titov was visibly upset. He withdrew into himself, hardly spoke at dinner, and a deep resentment could be read in his eyes. To be second in the Soviet Union meant finding oneself in an eternal, impenetrable shadow. Titov had undergone absolutely the same hellish tests. He was prepared for the flight no worse, and in many parameters even better than Gagarin. But he was deprived of the right to be a trailblazer due to political considerations and questionnaire data. On August 6, 1961, Titov made his historic flight on the Vostok 2 spacecraft. It was an incredibly difficult, first-ever day-long flight. If Gagarin spent only 108 minutes in space, completing one orbit in automatic mode, Titov spent 25 hours in orbit, made 17 revolutions around the Earth, and was the first to encounter the terrible syndrome of space sickness, when, due to the failure of the vestibular apparatus, he was violently nauseated with every movement of his head. He manually controlled the spacecraft, conducted scientific experiments, and was the first to sleep and eat in weightlessness. From an engineering and professional standpoint, Titov's flight was immeasurably more complex, important, and dangerous than Gagarin's. But for world history, and for the simple Soviet people, he forever remained only the second. At meetings, at official receptions, he was always introduced after Gagarin. His awards were slightly more modest, and the press's attention was more selective. This eternal shadow weighed heavily on his pride. Between Gagarin and Titov, despite their outward friendship and embraces for the television cameras, a deaf, painful tension persisted until the end of their days, born of unspoken envy on one side and a sense of awkwardness on the other. The subsequent fates of the members of the first cadre were also imbued with a spirit of tragedy and psychological pressure from the state system. Yuri Gagarin, having become a living symbol of the USSR, became a hostage to his own fame. The party leadership turned him into a ceremonial figurehead. He was paraded around the world, forced to speak at endless rallies and banquets. He was effectively banned from flying modern fighter jets and, moreover, was barred from new space missions, as the authorities were panicked by the potential death of the main Soviet brand. This gilded cage slowly destroyed Gagarin as a professional and as a person. He yearned for the sky, suffered from depression, which ultimately led to his mysterious and tragic death in an air crash in March 1968, which itself spawned dozens of new conspiracy theories, from liquidation on Brezhnev's orders to a simulated death and secret lifelong confinement in a KGB psychiatric hospital. The other cosmonauts of the cadre, Andrian Nikolaev, Pavel Popovich, Valery Bykovsky, also paid an enormous personal price for the right to be part of the Soviet myth. Their personal lives were strictly controlled by party committees. They were forced into nomenklatura marriages for a beautiful picture in the press, as was the case with the marriage of Nikolaev and the first female cosmonaut, Valentina Tereshkova, which was created on the direct orders of Khrushchev and turned into a years-long personal drama for both spouses. The Soviet space program was a great, undeniable triumph of human genius, science, and the courage of simple Soviet lads. But it was also a ruthless, totalitarian mechanism that did not hesitate to erase human personalities, break destinies, and blot out names from history for the sake of achieving momentary political gains and preserving the red facade of flawlessness. And now, comrades, as this hidden, profound, and dramatic underbelly of the great feat has been revealed to you, the time has come to ask that very main question that will force us to look at history from a completely different angle. What do you think? Was the choice of Sergei Korolev and the party leadership who bet on Gagarin a justified and fair step from the standpoint of the highest state interests? Or did the system commit a betrayal against Gherman Titov and other members of the cadre, who deserved first place no less, but became victims of ideological questionnaires and paranoid secrecy? Or perhaps among you, there are those who sincerely believe that the old safes in Lubyanka still hold yellowed folders with the names of those phantom pilots who flew to the stars and vanished forever in the cosmic night, even before the official April of '61. Share your thoughts, arguments, and versions in the comments under this text. Engage in heated historical debates, for it is in such disputes that the true face of our complex, contradictory, and great history is revealed. Be sure to subscribe to our updates. Click on all notifications so you don't miss new, detailed, impartial analyses of the secret pages of the Red Era, because ahead of us lie many more declassified archival materials that will make you forever change your perception of the past.